We're streaming live to a huge audience.
Hi everybody, welcome to our ACT class. Oh, here's the camera.
Yeah.
It would help if I looked at the camera. Okay, so we're going to start our first half of the class by covering grammar for the English section. So we're going to start off with notes. Someone could close the door for me. Thank you. We're going to start off by going over the rules as comprehensively as we can, and then we'll be going over the English section in the first test in your book. So, are you guys familiar with what independent clauses are?
It's a sentence that can stand on its own.
It's a full sentence that can stand on its own. It needs to have a subject, a verb, and what I call no complete ideas or dependent words. I should have finished the words here. Those are also called subordinating conjunctions. We don't need to know fancy grammar terms for this class. I want to keep it as simple as possible. You're going to learn just what you need to know for the ACT. So an independent clause, as we said, is something that stands on its own as a full sentence, such as the man threw the ball. So where's the subject and the verb in this sentence?
Well, subject is the man. The verb is through.
The verb is through. So the subject is the thing that does the verb, and the verb is the action word. So our other type of clause that we'll be discussing first is a dependent clause. This is a clause that cannot stand on its own as a complete sentence. It needs to be attached to an independent clause. It's usually missing a subject or a verb, or it's an independent clause with what I call a dependent word in it that changes an independent clause into a dependent clause. So here are some examples. The first one, throwing the ball, right? We don't have a subject here, and we don't actually have a main verb. Because gerunds, those words that end in ing, they're not really main verbs for the purpose of sentences. So usually it starts with one of these ing verbs, or, you see this is my original independent clause from the first section, the man threw the ball, but I added a word to it, like when. As you can see, if you just read it alone, you know it doesn't sound right. Like, what happens next? This is why I called it an incomplete idea. I didn't really finish the story here. Here, this is an incomplete list of dependent words, but these are subordinated conjunctions that you can put at the beginning of an independent clause that creates an incomplete idea. It makes it into a dependent clause. We have after, although, as, because, before, if, once, since, when, where, and while. It's not every single word there is, but I think it's enough that you guys get an idea of what it does.
And we should never use these in the start of a sentence.
Well, we'll get to that.
Okay.
It's just going to create a clause into a dependent clause. So you actually can use one of those words to start a sentence, but that just means our sentence starts with a dependent clause, and we'll have to follow it with a comma and then an independent clause. So the whole reason we even started with those clauses is because we have to know when to use commas. Right? This is the most commonly tested topic on the English section. The reason they do this is that pretty much nobody knows how to properly use commas. They're really, really overused, not just by high school students, but judging from emails I read, by everybody. So we really have to figure out when to use a comma, and we really have to pay attention to our clauses. So a single comma usually separates an independent clause and a dependent clause. I say usually because we use commas in other ways that have nothing to do with clauses. That's going to be less commonly seen on the ACT, but for instance, we might be separating two adjectives or separating the date exactly. Those uses for commas have nothing to do with clauses. The same thing with a comma before dialogue, right, before quotation and dialogue. But that's pretty unusual on the ACT, especially the last two things I mentioned. So a single comma on one side, it should be an independent clause, and on one side it should be a dependent clause. It doesn't matter which side they come on. So if you see in your answer choices, when we do the English section, we're always looking at the answer choices first to see what are they testing, what are the differences, and one of your answer choices is just a single comma. Just make sure that you read that one side of that is going to be an independent clause, it can stand on its own, the other side should be a dependent clause. Does anybody know how many independent clauses I can have in a sentence and how many dependent clauses I can typically have in a sentence?
One.
Usually one independent,
Yeah.
right? There are exceptions to that rule, which we'll get into, but
Is that with like semicolons and like?
yeah, exactly,
deductions?
and the comma and fanboys and everything. But usually we're going to have one independent clause, and we can have pretty much unlimited dependent clauses. If we have more than one independent clause in a sentence and they're not properly joined by special punctuation, that's what they mean by a run-on sentence. Run-on sentence does not mean it's a long sentence. You can have a long sentence that's not a run-on. Run-on means we have two independent clauses. Like, I was hot, comma, I was hungry. That's a really short sentence, but that's a run-on sentence because both of those clauses can stand on their own. Any questions so far? Okay. So this is a single comma. This is the most important thing to learn because this is the thing that people mess up the most. But sometimes we have double commas. If you see two commas around a clause in a sentence, this probably means we have a non-essential clause. I say probably because it could also mean I have an independent clause and two dependent clauses. So you have to keep it in mind. You have to read it both ways. But let's see what we mean by a non-essential clause. remember, looking for clauses is always the most important thing. The independent clause is what I'm always looking for first in a comma or punctuation question. For a non-essential clause, the independent clause comes around the non-essential clause. So we want to test two things if we're going to choose something that could be making a non-essential clause. So we test two things. First one, make sure the independent clause is around the non-essential clause. It's usually around it. Once in a while, it's on one side of it. We also need to make sure that the information within the non-essential clause isn't really important to the meaning of the sentence. If the sentence is about Mark Twain, we don't want to make the name Mark Twain non-essential. So two commas typically separate the non-essential clause, but you can also separate it with two dashes. It does the same thing.
Except it adds more of an emphasis on it.
In real life, it does. You don't really need to know that distinction for the exam, but yes, in general, a dash is a stronger punctuation mark than anything else. So you can separate with two dashes or two commas, or even parentheses. Yes.
Can you use an integration of both a dash and a comma, or no?
I'm glad you asked that. No.
Okay.
They have to match. Always make sure they match in a non-essential clause. If you happen to see a dash in your answer choices on the English section, the odds are extremely high it's going to be making a non-essential clause. So if you see a dash, check the rest of the sentence for another dash to see if they match. There is a different use for single dash, which we'll get into soon. All right, any questions? Okay. So now we have an example of when we can join two independent clauses. It has a stupid name, but it's the best thing that anyone could come up with to memorize
Conjunctions
these words.
or fanboys.
Yeah, coordinated conjunctions or fanboys. I'm going to call them fanboys. I want to avoid as much grammar terminology as I can. So our words here are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. You put a comma plus a fanboys. The comma comes before one of them. For instance, comma end. It's kind of a period. It's kind of a period because it separates two independent clauses or two full sentences. So you can separate two full sentences, two independent clauses with a comma for, a comma and, a comma nor, etc. I say it's kind of a period because these words also have meanings. So replacing a period with a comma but, that changes the relationship of the clauses. So we want to be careful about not just using them interchangeably. So for example, I was happy, independent clause, comma and, I got a lot done, another independent clause. This is the proper use of fanboys. that's about it for commas. So does anyone else know how else I can separate two independent clauses?
A period or a semicolon?
A period or semicolon. Does anyone know the difference between a period and semicolon? In real life, there is a difference, right? A semicolon needs to separate two sentences that are related to each other, right?
A period doesn't.
But we don't need to know that for the ACT. This test, as far as I've seen in the dozens and dozens of tests I've seen, they use them interchangeably. They just separate two independent clauses. So if you see a semicolon, think to yourself, it's just like a period. Make sure that you read on each side and that each side is a full sentence. Therefore, if I see in my answer choices, and they have the same exact words, but one has a period and the other has a semicolon.
No change.
Well,
that would be answer B.
No.
Yeah, so.
Oh, yeah,
like-
that was my no change. Sorry, the A was my no change. But I would cross them both out.
Okay.
Right, whatever, I would have to choose a different answer choice, put it that way. Because I can't have two answers that do the same thing. For the purpose of this test, they are essentially identical. Alright, so, period, semicolon, and fanboys. These always separate two full sentences every single time. Now there are two other punctuation marks that can separate two independent clauses, but they don't have to every time. So if you have one of these three, period, semicolon, fanboys, make sure each side is a full sentence. We're going to get into some punctuation that most of the students find intimidating, but it's not too bad. So we've got our colon / single dash. I'm treating these as the same punctuation marks because they do pretty much the same thing on this test. So colon is this thing with the dots, dash is opposite that. So, so after the colon or the dash, we need a list or an explanation. I use the term explanation very, very, very broadly. It just needs to say more about the thing that came before the colon. It could be definition, you could be rephrasing what came before, you could be saying a consequence of what came before, but it needs to continue from what came before the colon, or it could be a list. The thing that people usually forget is what comes before.
Has to be a full clause.
Very good, a full sentence, an independent clause. So this is an incorrect example. There are many things to study, comma, such as math, science, and English. What comes after the colon is fine because that's a list of what we were talking about before. However, this is not an independent clause. There are many things to study, comma, such as, period. That doesn't make any sense. If you want to use that such as, then you need to get rid of the colon. If you want to use the colon, you just get rid of the such as. And then this makes sense, because there are many things to study, period. We can say, you can use that, therefore we can use the colon or the single dash. Here's another proper use of a colon or dash. The ACT is difficult, dash, it is very fast paced. So this, what comes after the dash is related to what comes before it, so it's kind of an explanation as to why it's difficult. And if you notice, they're both independent clauses. That's okay. We need to have an independent clause before the colon or the dash, but really any kind of clause or list can come after it. We don't care. Any questions on the colon or dash? Okay, very good. Now we have apostrophes. If you have an apostrophe before the S, that's either showing singular possession or a contraction. So singular possession, it's possessed by a singular thing or person, like the boy's shoes. It's a single boy, those are his shoes. Or it's a contraction, like the boy's hungry. The boy is hungry, the boy was hungry, something like that. If the apostrophe comes after the S, then that's plural possession. Like the two boys' shoes. We're talking about more than one boy. Does anyone know the exception to these apostrophe rules? These are the two big exceptions. Typically, you're not going to use an apostrophe to show possession for a pronoun. But the ones that people mess up are its and whose. ITS, that's possessive. No apostrophe to show possessive its. IT apostrophe S is always a contraction, meaning it is, it was, it has. Same thing with whose. The possessive form of whose is WHOSE. Who apostrophe S means who is, who was, who has. It's always a contraction. One final word of warning, never use an apostrophe to make a word plural. So if we want to say the two boys, it's just B-O-Y-S, no apostrophe. careful when you're using pronouns that it's clear that we know who or what the pronoun is referring to.
Why'd you write it twice?
Oh, that was just a mistake.
Okay.
Apologies. For instance, Lee said Mary baked a pie, period. Her pie was delicious. I don't know which woman her is referring to. So the only way to fix this is by being specific. It never hurts to be specific about the person or thing you're talking about, rather than using a pronoun. So if you see answer choices like this, where 3 of them are like non-specific pronouns, like he, she, and it, and one of them is specific. The specific one is almost always going to be a better choice. You can never lose by being specific. So if he, she, it, the advertisers is a better choice. This throws some students because as we get into later on in our lesson, wordiness is often tested. So we sometimes want to choose shorter answer choices, but sometimes shorter is bad because it can make us be more vague and less specific.
Wait, from that sentence example that you gave with Lisa and May, isn't that implying that there's only one pie from the first sentence?
Maybe they baked it together, or whatever. I mean,
But then wouldn't it mean that both their pies are
they-
delicious?
they baked pies.
Okay.
They baked pies. Lisa's pie was delicious. This actually has 2 problems in it, but we want to make sure that the number is correct. Mary and Lisa tried to catch a plane, comma, but she missed it. So not only is this vague, but it's the wrong number. They missed it. So if you have more than one person, make sure you use they. If you have more than one object also, that could be they. They doesn't have to refer to people. But it, never use it to refer to a person. It is always referring to a singular object. Make sure your pronouns are consistent. If you're starting off a passage or a paragraph by saying, one should study hard for the ACT, one should practice one's math skills, we can't then switch to you and say, you should also study your English rules. Make sure they're consistent. Does anybody know what subject-verb agreement is?
Yeah.
What does that deal with?
It deals with like the right amount of people that the subjects like
Yeah.
they, the verb has to also agree with that.
Yes,
as well.
so if we have a plural subject, we need to have a plural
Plural
verb.
verb.
We have a singular subject, we have a singular verb. So make sure if it's plural or singular that they match. Easy subject-verb agreement questions are really obvious. the dog fetched its ball, right? It's a singular dog. It's not hard to figure that out. Or sorry, it should be not past tense. But the dog fetches its ball, right? That's pretty obvious because the subject and the verb are right next to each other. We're not going to have usually easy, obvious questions for subject-verb agreement. So the first step is learning how to recognize that it's a subject-verb agreement question. So you're going to see these pairs of words or verbs in your answer choices. And this will be a clue that it might be testing subject-verb agreement. So we've got is, are, was, were, has, have, or any other verb pair where it's the same verb in the same tense, because these are all the same verb and in the same tense, but one ends in an S and the other doesn't. These are very strong clues that this is subject-verb agreement. So the first thing you want to do in a subject-verb agreement question is locate the subject, and they're probably not going to make this easy. They make it hard to find the subject by two main ways. The book, comma, which was green, comma, is or are on the table. What's the subject of this sentence? What is or are on the table? Yes?
The book.
The book, good. The subject will never be within the non-essential clause. So here we separated the subject and the verb with a non-essential clause. They're always trying to separate the subject and the verb to make it really hard to do these questions. Another way, and this is probably a little more common, of separating the subject from the verb is using a prepositional phrase, or a prep phrase for short. It's a phrase that describes the subject, and it usually starts with a preposition, which you don't need to memorize them. There's going to be short words like of, with, on, and it's describing the subject. Usually the first thing that could be the subject is the subject. So in this case, the subject is still book, so the answer would be is. But a lot of students, when I give them this example for the first time, they choose are. Why are people choosing are?
Because people believe that poems is the actual subject.
Or they're not even thinking about it, and it just sounds right to say poems are on the table. Because this one was a little easier to get right, even if you didn't know, because right before the verb was a singular word, and the subject was also singular. But usually they're not going to match because they're trying to trick you into getting it wrong. So always be on the lookout for the prepositional phrase. The subject typically is going to appear 3 to 7 words to the left of the of the verb. Sometimes we can have 2 prepositional phrases. This is a really hard one. What will be the right answer here? One of the colors on the walls is or are green.
Is.
Is. What's the subject?
One.
One, yeah. These inclusive words like one, all, these are considered subjects, and they're singular subjects. We have 2 prepositional phrases here, of the colors and on the walls. This one's going to be pretty rare, but you will see words like one that you'll need to be aware of. This is the most common with a prepositional phrase. This is the second most common with a non-essential clause. Now we're going to cover tenses. I feel pretty confident that you guys know the basic tenses: past, present, perfect. future, sorry, but we're gonna cover the perfect tenses. The first one we're gonna cover is past perfect, because this is by far the more common one that you'll see. Not that it's a common question, but they usually have a perfect tense question or answer choice, and if they do, it's usually past perfect. We know it because it's usually gonna have the word had in it. So if you see in the answer choices, had gone, like it's gonna be had plus another past verb. This refers to an event that happened before something else in the past. Before World War II, my great-grandparents had gotten married. Before I woke up, I had brushed my teeth. So here we have two things that happened in the past, and these things with the had happened before those past tense events. We have present perfect. We'll recognize this because it'll start with has or have, and then have another present tense verb next to it. It usually refers to something that started in the past and continues on into the present or future. For instance, I have been studying for 3 months. It less commonly refers to something that happened in an indefinite time in the past, like I have read this book before, but I can't recall ever seeing that on the ACT, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. And this isn't as common as the past perfect. This is way less common on the ACT, future perfect. It refers to something that will be completed in the future. You'll see will have plus past tense verb. I will have completed my graduation requirements in 2019. Next we have parallelism or parallel structure. Number one, the listed verbs should have the same verb form. Can anyone tell me if this is correct or incorrect? I went hiking, swimming, and I rode horses.
Oh.
No, we're not.
Because rode is in the past tense.
We have hiking, swimming. We could fix this by saying horseback riding. The verbs need to be in the same form. The first form is what you're going to see the most on the ACT, and it's also the easiest to recognize, fortunately. But you also want to make sure that sentences that have lists of maybe even only two things, or comparisons, that they have matching structures as well. I love to drive my car and to ride my bike. This one's more subtle. It's harder to match them. I like sunny California more than rainy Washington. If I'm describing one thing with an adjective and comparing it to another, I should also describe that thing with a similar type of adjective. I can't just say I like sunny California more than Washington. I would rather be a librarian than be a chef. Parallel structure, they're matching in form.
Paper, please.
Did everyone get this down?
Thank you very much.
Next we have idioms. These are very tricky problems because they don't follow standard English rules. They usually test the use of preposition. Words like in, on, to, with, by, etc. So here's some examples: angry in him versus angry with him, wait on the plane versus wait for the plane. These ones are fairly obvious. They're easier because I've condensed the phrase into a small thing. The best way to do these questions is to isolate the words that you're dealing with. Try to isolate the idiom and use your ears. Say it to yourself, in your head, not out loud, and go with what sounds the best for you to you. These are very hard for students who didn't grow up speaking English because they have to memorize lists of thousands and thousands of them. It's not worth your time to memorize them for the 1 or 2 questions you're going to find on the test. Did you have a question?
No, I'm sorry, what is that? Does that say M? Wait, M, the plane?
Wait on the plane.
Okay.
Sorry. Versus wait for the plane. Try and write quickly. Does anyone know the difference between who and whom?
Who is plural and whom is singular?
That's a common misconception, but I'm glad you brought that up. It has nothing to do with singular or plural. They can both refer to singular or plural things. Who typically refers to a subject and whom to an object. We don't need to know that because we have an easier trick. You're going to plug in a word. Instead of using who, if you can plug in he or they if it's talking about a plural thing, but usually we're going to use he, then you can use who. If that sounds right, you go with who. If him or them sound better, then you go with whom. Because these things are both objects, whom is an object. That's why they match. This is easy to remember because him and them and whom all end in M. So here we have modifiers. We don't need to know the term, we just need to know the concept. Basically, dependent clauses should refer to the subject of their independent clauses. Is this correct or incorrect? Flying for the first time, comma, the roar of the engines frightened the child. Got a 50-50 shot. This is wrong. Does anyone know why this is wrong?
Because the
Where's our dependent clause?
flying for the first time.
Flying. Usually if it starts with one of these ing verbs, a gerund, that's usually going to be dependent clause. So who was flying for the first time? There's only one thing that could be flying, right?
The child.
The child. But what's the subject of that independent clause?
The engines.
Well,
The roar.
the roar of the engines, right? So this makes it look like the roar of the engines is flying for the first time. So the subject, the dependent clause should be referring to the subject of the independent clause. So you want to make sure that it logically makes sense. So this is how you fix it. You make what this is referring to the actual subject of the independent clause. Flying for the first time, comma, the child was frightened by the roar of the engines. Next we have active voice versus passive voice. Active voice, the man threw the ball. The subject does the verb. This is what we want on the ACT every time. Passive voice, the ball was thrown by the man. Notice this sounds perfectly fine. This actually is grammatically correct, but the ACT will consider it wrong. They want you to always choose active voice. It's considered better writing in most circumstances. So if you see passive, you cross it off. That means the verb was done by the subject. You want the subject to typically come first. Now we have transition words. So words of addition, also, moreover, furthermore, similarly, in fact, likewise, indeed. This is not a complete list, but it's enough to give you an idea that these are words that are adding more of a similar type of information. Here are some examples of words of contrast: however, nonetheless, still, instead, meanwhile. This means our sentence that has this word and the sentence before will be contrasting with each other, or two clauses within the same sentence will be contrasting, or two ideas will be contrasting. We also have words of causation. These ones are where the cause comes before the effect. Thus, therefore, consequently, so. I stayed up late last night, so I'm tired today. The cause comes before the effect. Because and since, flip it around. I'm tired because I stayed up late. Be very careful when you see questions that are testing these. You'll know it's testing it because all the answer choices are going to be filled with transition words. They're easy to mess up because they're all going to sound grammatically correct, so you really need to slow down and pay attention to the logic of the sentence or sentences and focus on their relationship with one another. Okay, I'm on my last page, so we're almost done with the English rules. Do you guys have any questions so far? All right, let's finish this up. So the English section does not only test grammar. Sometimes it tests redundancy. Or that means like you're repeating the same concept. It's not going to be repeating the same exact words, but the concept. For instance, I was nervous and anxious. This is not good, because nervous and anxious
In the same thing.
close enough that they're considered redundant. So you want to just pick one and get rid of the redundant word. I might also be repeating something that came earlier in the passage. So maybe I mentioned that this business is located in Philadelphia in paragraph 2, and now in paragraph 3, I said it again. I don't need to repeat it twice. Those ones are a lot harder to catch. A similar concept is wordiness. So if you see this pattern in your answer choices, where 3 of the answer choices are significantly longer than 1, or 2 are significantly longer than other 2, this is a very, very strong clue that we're probably testing wordiness, and you want to choose one of these shorter answers. Just obviously read it and make sure that it makes sense. This includes answer choices that say delete. If you can delete an answer choice and the sentence is grammatically correct and we're not losing any essential information, then delete is a good answer choice. Don't be afraid to choose delete. These kind of questions, as well as grammar questions, these are only referring to questions that don't have question stems. You guys have all taken the ACT before, so you know on the English section, sometimes you have a question to read, sometimes it's just answer choices. Grammar and redundancy and wordiness comes into play for those questions without question stems. We'll actually get into the other question type as we're reviewing the English section. So we have some commonly confused words. Did that backwards. So words like fewer and less and many and much, people confuse these a lot. You actually see them misused in real life all the time. Like if you go to the grocery store and you go to the express line and it says 15 items or less, that's actually wrong.
You have to use fewer because you can count 15
You can
items.
count them, very good. Yeah, fewer and many refer to countable units, whereas less and much are non-countable. This gets confusing because a word like dollars is considered countable units, but a word like money is not. This is confusing. Don't think too logically. Like, obviously you can count money. So I like to think of it, can you put 5 in front of it? If you can put 5 instead of fewer or many, then fewer or many will also work. Can I say I have $5? Yes, then I can say I have fewer dollars. I can't say I have 5 money, therefore I'd have to go with less or much money. Fewer or many would go with bananas. Less and much would go with fruit. I can say I have 5 bananas, but I can't say I have 5 fruit.
So mainly it'd be like more specific than.
Yeah, more specific, like you're referring to the individual units of whatever the thing is. Okay. Last few things. These are just more commonly confused words. The first and last are pretty common on recent ACTs. Affect versus effect. Does anyone know the general difference between these two words?
Affect is like the result of something. The effect is like. I don't have to be as confused, but
I
I
think
know
you've
one.
switched
Yeah,
it.
yeah. Effect is a result of something, and then affect is how like it affects something.
Yes. So I tried long and hard to think of an easy way to remember the difference. This is enough for the ACT. In real life, it's a little more complicated, but think of it this way. Affect starts with an A because it's an action word or a verb. So if I was affected by something, that would be with an A, because verb is going to end in an ED. Or if it affects something, that's an A. It's functioning as a verb in the sentence. Effect with an E, this one's much less of a good trick. Effect is a result. I know it's stupid, but I can't think of anything else to memorize that with. But as long as you remember that A effect with an A is an action word or a verb, that should be enough. Real life, it's a little more complex, but actually this rule is enough to get your real life stuff correct 99% of the time anyway. Does anyone know the difference between the two principles? Principal, right?
That's like your like principle. Like
He's your friend, right?
And
Like
then the principle is like a general like. I guess a rule.
yeah, it's a rule, which also ends in LE, right? Principal is like the head of a school or business, or it could even be the main idea of something, but I highly doubt you'll ever see that in the ACT. This one's much harder, and I've seen this a lot lately. It's past with an ED versus past with an ST. Notice I underlined the ED. What kind of word usually ends in an ED?
Well, that pass is referring like you passed like the ball.
Yeah,
Passed it.
because it's a
Yeah.
verb, right? It's functioning as the verb because past tense verbs end in ED.
It's a past verb.
But don't get them mixed up
Yeah.
because that's the actual other spelling of past. So like you passed the exam, right? That's functioning as your main verb in the sentence. Past with an ST is never going to be your main verb.
It's a tense.
Well, you're not going to usually see it used that way on the ACT. What you would see, it would be like, like the man walked past the school.
Okay.
The easiest way to describe this is kind of like an adverb, where it needs to attach itself to a main verb. It's never going to be your main verb. Okay, any questions? All right, so let's open up our books to the first test. Now when I refer to a test, I usually refer to the test code. Now sometimes the test code will be printed on the first page, like this one is 72E, but it's not always. Sometimes it's in the bottom left corner of every page. That should give you the test code. So I will, if I ask you guys what test you're on, or I tell you the test, I'm going to be referring to the code. So did any of you guys have issues with timing on the English section? No? Did you guys have extra time at the end?
A little bit.
A little bit. I'm glad no one has timing. It's pretty usual by the time you get these English rules down pat to probably have extra time at the end of the English section. If you have extra time on any section of the test, go back to the questions that you were confused about the first time. So if you're not sure of an answer, circle it and come back to it later if you have time. But don't just randomly go searching through questions looking to change answers, because you end up overthinking in that case, and usually your first inclination was correct. The rule I use for deciding whether or not to change an answer is if I'm absolutely sure my new answer is better, then I'll change it. If I'm still unsure, I typically leave the first answer that I came up with. So let's look at our first question. Now, in the English section, you really don't have to read every single sentence as you go. Sometimes you have questions that require you to know the main idea of a passage or a paragraph. Sometimes you might go back and read some of it, reread it, but don't focus on reading every sentence and understanding the meaning of the passage the first read through. But if it's testing grammar, which means we don't have a question stem, make sure you read until the end of the sentence. Always go to the period, because you might stop early and miss, for instance, a run-on sentence. So if I don't have a question stem, I always look at my answer choices first to figure out what I'm testing. For instance, in number 1, what are the differences between my answer choices? We've got A, I have a period, or I have a colon, I have a semicolon, or I have nothing. So here I'm obviously testing. Am I in the wrong test?
Yeah, I believe so. 72E.
I'm on 73E.
Oh.
Okay, thank you for pointing that out. Please don't be shy.
Right.
Tell me I'm on the wrong test. So you guys said 72E?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so what does that start with?
An approximation of the distance that humans typically travel on a daily basis to obtain food.
Oh, okay. Okay, so this is a different type of question. Let's look at number 2 first. So I noticed the difference between my answer choices. I have a period, I have a comma, I have a semicolon, and I have nothing. So here I'm clearly testing punctuation. What should I focus on when I'm testing punctuation?
Consistency.
Consistency, and what kind of things do I want to make sure are correct? We have our clauses, right? So do I notice 2 answer choices that are identical in number 2?
Yeah, H and F.
H and F, right? Because a period and a semicolon, you just have to make sure that the words match. So if the words change, it might not be the same. But we can't have 2 right answers, so F and H are out. Now I have a choice between a comma and no commas. What needs to be on each side of a single comma?
Dependent clause.
1 independent and 1 dependent, right? So let's take a look at what's going on with the comma first. Yet no matter how winding a path ants might have taken to find food, is that an independent clause or dependent clause? Can that stand on its own?
That's a dependent clause.
That's dependent. We've got yet before it, right? That definitely can't be an independent clause. With a comma, they are able to navigate back to their starting point with remarkable precision. Can that stand on its own?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
it can. Some students hesitate because they think if you start a sentence with they or some sort of pronoun, that it's not an independent clause because we don't know who they is referring to. It's okay. Pronouns can function as subjects. So since I have an independent and a dependent, G is our best answer. However, if you're on a comma question and you can't choose between two answer choices, one has fewer commas or no commas, and one has more commas, for most questions, the ACT favors fewer commas. So if you can't decide, a good tiebreaker is to go the one with fewer commas in it. The only exception to this
It's
is
the Oxford comma.
the all Oxford comma.
Oh.
I don't know, have you ever seen them test it? I don't
Yeah,
know. Really?
I got it wrong.
That's pretty unusual.
I
I'm
know, I was mad about it.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Let's cover the Oxford comma then. Do you guys know what that means? So if you have a list of 3 or more things, like I bought bananas, comma, apples, comma, and pears. We were probably told that that comma before the end is optional. You don't have to use it. On the ACT, they always prefer it. Anytime I see them write a list, they always put that comma in. It's called an Oxford comma. You don't need to know what that is called. You just need to know to use the comma. We don't consider it optional. But what I was referring to, as far as the exception to the rule, is there's usually 1, maybe 2 super hard comma questions on every exam. You'll probably know it when you see it after you've done enough practice exams, because you look at this and be like, what the heck is going on? There's commas everywhere. I don't know what's happening. Usually the best answer to that question is the one with the most number of commas. That's the one exception to the rule. Alright, so let's look at number 1. Here we have a question stem question. It's probably not testing grammar at all. So we have to really, really focus on the question stem. I often underline keywords in the question stem so I can really focus on what they want. Also, I like to reread my questions to make sure I answered it properly, but I don't want to reread the whole thing because a lot of those words are not necessary for me, so I'll go back and reread what I underlined. So here, if the writer were to delete the parenthetical information just means the information within the parentheses. The essay would primarily lose what? So there's nothing to underline in this question stem, but what they're really asking is, what is that information adding to the sentence? It's just a really annoying way. Yes?
Is it a detail that puts his ants travel on a scale of years maybe up there equal to action?
Yeah, exactly. So we have ants search for food can require traveling as far as 100 meters away from their nests. That doesn't mean much to me because that doesn't sound like it's really far, but they're telling us, well, that's equivalent to a human walking 15 miles. That puts it in perspective, right? Like, oh wow, that's a really long time, a really long distance that they walk. So good, B is our best answer. A detail that puts the distance ants travel on a scale readers might be able to imagine. Number 3, by the way, the question stem questions are going to take you longer, so don't worry about spending like the same amount of time on every question. The grammar one should go faster because either you know the rule or you don't. The question stem questions require us to think more about it. So which choice most clearly introduces the research question central to the essay? Here I would probably underline research question. Right, that's what I really want to focus on. Let's take a look. We have to test their scientific hypothesis. A team of research biologists studied ants in the Tunisian desert. Could this be introducing a research question?
No.
I mean, kind of.
But it's very ambiguous.
It's very ambiguous, it's very vague. Just to test their scientific hypothesis. Usually for these types of questions, they tell us to clearly introduce it, or they might say specific details are going to be better, even if the answer is technically right.
So it'd be C.
C, to determine how ants accomplish this navigational task. C is way more specific than the other answer choices. So remember before, when we said, we don't want wordiness, right? That rule goes out the window with question stem questions. If they're asking me to be clear or specific or to illustrate something, I frequently need to use more words to achieve that. A and D are too short to do this. Okay, number 4. I have will place, have placed, placed, and place. So it looks like we're dealing with tense here. The scientist blank food a short distance from the ant's home and then tracked the ant's paths to the food. How do I know which answer choice will work the best here? Yes?
You look in the previous sentence to find what tense we're in.
Okay, we can look in the previous sentence. This can be complicated though, because I might be describing an event that happened at another point, but that is usually my first step. But I actually saw something in this sentence itself.
Tracked.
Yeah, they tracked. So not only do we want to match that tense, but we want to keep it parallel. So we want to say the scientist placed food and tracked the ant's paths. So the answer to 4 is H. Number 4. Sorry, just number 4. Number 5. So I see that delete is an option. I like to test delete first. I'm not saying it's always the answer, but it frequently is because it's the shortest one. So let's see if we can work this without whatever's in there. The scientist placed food a short distance from the ant's home and then tracked to the food. Did that make sense?
No.
No, tracked what to the food? It doesn't make any sense. Let's get rid of delete. So out of the remaining answer choices, one is way shorter than the others, right? Notice that A is only 3 words and B and C are way more. So the odds are extremely high we're going to have A here because we're testing redundancy in this question. Can I say it with just A? The scientist placed food a short distance from the ant's home and then tracked the ant's paths to the food. Is that grammatically correct? Yeah, what's the problem with B and C?
It's very redundant. It's like the paths that were taken by the ants as they went.
Yeah, we don't have to say taken by the ants as they went. Good.
And the ants' paths that the ants took.
So now we're repeating ants unnecessarily. So this is actually testing redundancy as well. Number 6. The first thing I notice is that it's starting with either involving or involved, and then we're going from relocating or relocated. So the team's first experiment blanked the ants after they'd found the food. Do you want to use involved or involving?
Involved.
Involved, because that's functioning as the main verb in the sentence. A gerund or an ing verb is never going to, or ing word is never going to be the main verb. So we want to have involved. What makes more sense, G or J?
J.
J. G is just adding unnecessary words. So the team's first experiment involved relocating the ants after they'd found the food. Okay, number 7. They also tested what they referred to as the pedometer hypothesis. Looking at the answer choices, the only difference I have are commas. Now, the first thing I notice is D. It's really common to put a comma in front of quotation marks, right? Why do I not want to put that comma here?
Because it's not saying that they like specific, like they didn't like say it, like
yeah.
Jimmy said.
Yeah, the rule to put the comma before the quotation marks every time applies when we're talking about dialogue. Like Jimmy said, comma, and then we have our quotation marks.
And also there's a period within the quotation marks, which only is allowed to be when it's not from dialogue.
Okay. We don't have to worry too much about that because we usually don't have dialogue on the English section. So typically you're not going to have a comma in front of quotation marks unless it makes sense for another reason. But remember the rule, fewer commas are usually better. So I like to test no commas first. Can we say this without any commas?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you can say it with no commas, no comma is a better answer choice. So the answer to number 7 is A. Number 8, do I notice a pattern in my answer choices? Yes.
One is much shorter than the others.
One is much shorter. We have long, 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 short. 99% chance that J is going to be our answer. can we say it with just J? With the extended legs, the ants moved a greater distance with each step. Is that grammatically correct?
Yes.
Yeah, the chances are very high that it is. Yeah, J is our best answer. What's the problem with the other answer choices? It looks like they all mention pig hair. That the leg extensions were made of pig hair, which is very strange to think about. But why do I not want to say that in this sentence? Yeah.
It's redundant if you keep on mentioning the point.
Well, if you look at the sentence before, right, we already said it.
Yeah, the pig hair.
Yeah,
So you live right up to it.
exactly. So it's redundant because we mentioned it in the sentence before. I don't want to say it again. Number 9. This is actually a pretty hard question. So let's look at A. Marching far past their nest on the way home, the researchers determined that ants count their steps. Yeah.
Is it a little ambiguous because you don't know who's marching towards the nest? Like
Well,
the researchers are right after.
sort of. Yeah, that's the problem.
And you also don't know the, I guess the verb tense.
Well, we don't need the tense necessarily for marching because that's the start of a dependent clause. So that's okay to start a dependent clause with the ing. But remember, the subject of that dependent clause is going to be subject of the independent clause that it's attached to. What's the subject of the independent clause?
The ants.
No, we're looking at the next.
Oh.
The
The
researchers.
researchers.
Yeah, the researchers determine that the ants count their steps. So the researchers is a subject. Makes it look like the researchers marched past their nest. But obviously the researchers aren't marching and the researchers don't have a nest. What's the only thing that clarifies that it's the ants marching? Yeah.
B.
B, good. This is actually the longest answer choice, so we have to be a little flexible with the long and the short thing. The long, short rule usually comes into play if 3 or 2 of them are long and only 1 or 2 are short. So good, the answer to 9 is B. Now 10, we just discussed this, right? We've got the 2 different pasts. Do we want the past with an ED here or the past with an ST? The ants marched far past their nest.
I was going to say it would be no change.
Yeah.
No change, good. Why do we not want to have the ED, the
Because
PASS?
past means like the verb, like they passed
Yeah.
something.
That would be the verb, but what's the verb here?
Past is like they walked by.
Yeah, the verb, the main verb in this sentence.
Oh, marching.
March, or
March.
we chose B, right? It's marched. So that's actually the main verb. If we have a main verb, then we have to use the past with the ST. Which there would be correct. Do we want to say THERE or THEIR?
THEIR.
THEIR because we're talking about possession, right? THERE would be like a location or something. So the answer to number 10 is F. Number 11, which choice reiterates information most relevant to the essay at this point? How do I tell if information is relevant? What should I do first? Let's read the context here to see what we're talking about. Plenty of questions remain. I'm starting at the beginning of the paragraph. For instance, why were the ants' paths back to their nests more direct than the ants' routes to the food? The scientists suspected that the ants, in addition to blank, were constantly maintaining a sense of their location in relation to the nest. Notice I said blank. I'm not reading choice A. There's a 75% chance that no change is wrong. And I don't want to read it the first time because that might make me biased toward choosing it. So what are we talking about here in these sentences?
Their steps.
Their steps,
Their route.
how are they navigating, right? How are they maintaining a sense of their location? So let's look at our answer choices. Is it really relevant to know they have an exoskeleton?
No.
No. How about the fact that there's social insects from the, however you say that,
No.
whatever family? No,
That's
we don't care
irrelevant.
about. What's probably the best answer choice here?
Counting their steps.
Counting their steps, yeah, because we're talking about how they march, how they find their way back.
Isn't it also parallel structure because the term the ants in the previous paragraph, the last sentence?
It may be. Typically, they're not testing grammar in these answer choices, but that might be true as well. Number 12. So the first thing I notice about these answer choices is F and G have an apostrophe with sons and H and J do not. Do I want an apostrophe there? Remember, an apostrophe is used to show possession or to make a contraction.
You do want the apostrophe?
We want the apostrophe because it's the
It's the
position of
son's.
the son, right? It's possessed. Possession doesn't necessarily mean it literally owns it. It just like belongs to it. So it's the son's position. That would be an apostrophe. Do we want that comma after sky?
No.
No, because that we wouldn't have an independent clause anywhere. That would say, were they using the sun's position in the sky? Then as a marker of time and location, we just want to go with F. No comma is better. Number 13. Looks like we want to figure out where to put that question mark. Well, let's look at A. Were they using the sun's position in the sky as a marker of time and location? Do we want a question mark there, or do we want a period or a semicolon?
Question mark.
Question mark, because we're starting with were, right? We need to be asking a question. So I'm going to cross off C and D. So the only difference between A and B, oh wait, we also cross off A, don't we?
Yeah.
So it's B. That's the only one that has a question mark. Number 14. The writer is considering adding the following sentence to the essay. If the writer were to add this sentence, it would logically be placed at which point? This is really asking us, well, we want to look for clues in the sentence itself, and we want to look for clues in the sentences or the paragraphs surrounding it. Do we see a clue in this sentence?
Yeah. The desert was the ideal place to study ants.
How's that going to help me place this
Because
sentence?
it tells you like where they first started conducting their research.
Yeah, so it would have to
Yeah.
come after we already introduced the research and after we've actually introduced the concept of the desert. Are we ready for break? Can we wait 2 minutes? Okay.
Sorry, kids.
We're just almost done with the passage. So where do we talk about the desert?
Perfect.
Yeah, they introduced the desert in paragraph 1, add the letter A, so it's just a team of research biologists studied ants in the testing desert, so you would think that they would want to elaborate on that point in more detail.
It would make sense there. We also have to make sure we're not interrupting two things that need to go back to back. So as long as we're not interrupting the sentence before and after that, that's a good place to put it. And the answer to that one is A. Let's do 15, then we'll take our break. Suppose the writer's primary purpose had been to briefly summarize some scientific research that investigates one particular skill of an animal or insect. Would this essay accomplish that purpose? This is a very long question stem. I want to underline the important phrases here. Here I underline summarize some scientific research and one particular skill of an animal or insect. Now, you might not really be paying attention to the content as you read the English section because you're focused on little parts, you're focused on the grammar. So there's a trick to figure out the main idea if you don't remember it. First, and this also works for the reading section as well, as we'll see. The first step is to read the title. Sometimes the title's useless, sometimes it's extremely useful. The ants go marching. Then I'm going to read the first sentence of every paragraph. Do you guys know what function the first sentence of a paragraph serves?
Introduction.
Introduction, yes, it is. It's a topic sentence, good. And I'm going to read the last sentence of the last paragraph because that's basically giving me an outline of the whole passage. So let's take a look. Ants search for food can require traveling as far as 100 meters from their nests. Next paragraph. To determine how ants accomplish this navigational task, a team of research biologists studied ants in the Tunisian desert. Next paragraph. The team's first experiment involved relocating the ants after they'd found the food. Next paragraph. They also tested what they referred to as the pedometer hypothesis. Next paragraph. Plenty of questions remain. For instance, why were the ants' paths back to their nest more direct than the routes to the food? Last sentence of the whole passage. Even with these uncertainties, the research team was confident it was on the path to figuring out how ants are able to navigate relatively long distances. So, yes or no, is this summarizing scientific research about a particular skill of an animal or insect? Is this scientific? Is scientific research here? Yeah, why? What did we study? What did we do? We wanted to see how the ants were navigating, right? We were conducting experiments. What would be the skill of the ant, the skill of the animal or insect here?
How they travel.
How they traveled, how they found their way, how they navigate their way back home after traveling long distances every day to find food. So I'm going to get rid of C and D because this would be a yes answer. A, yes, because it outlines some experiments conducted by a team of researching navigation techniques of ants. Or B, because it summarizes the navigational methods of a number of animals that have to travel long distances. Did we discuss a number of animals here, or just
No,
ants?
just
No,
ants.
just ants. That's why B is wrong, and A is our best answer. Okay, so we're gonna take our break now. So if you guys need to use the restroom, I'll show you where it is.